All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. My name is Corbin Campbell. I am one of the ASHE 2020 program co-chairs, and I'm so pleased that you all are joining us this afternoon to talk about best practices for a high-quality peer review process for the ASHE 2020 conference. Later today, you'll be hearing from also ASHE President, Dr. Carrie Ann O'Mara, and some really fantastic panelists who have great experience in reviewing proposals for ASHE specifically. And we're really feeling like this is such an important component of what ASHE does as a community. And before we get started, I wanted to start by acknowledging the land of the ASHE office. The ASHE office is headquartered at UNLV and recognized that it sits on the unceded land of the Southern Paiutes, descendants of the Tutanu, or desert people, who have lived along the Colorado River since 1100 AD and extended north and west into the areas known today as Southern Nevada, Utah, and California. ASHE also acknowledges that the university and members of the UNLV community has and continues to benefit from the use of Southern Paiute land. So to start off, I just want to give us a sense of orientation to this webinar. First of all, to change the video of the speakers, and I would definitely recommend doing this so that you can see the active speaker here. You can click the active speaker or the floating layout buttons in the top right screen. And again, I would recommend that active speaker button specifically during the presentation portion. And then you could possibly switch to the floating layout portion to see all of the panelists at the end of the webinar. And I also wanted to mention, if you have any questions during this webinar pertaining to the reviewer process, please use the Q&A function on the right side of the screen. So we won't have time for questions and answers during this presentation because we have a full agenda, but we're so fortunate to have the other ASHE 2020 co-chair, Dr. Julie Park, to be able to answer questions as you have them and in real time during this webinar. So thanks so much, Julie, for doing that. And I also wanted to mention that all of the information we're discussing today can be, and specifically the examples that we're going to be going through today of constructive and unconstructive reviews can be found at this website, which is the ASHE website /reviewer resources. So please do take advantage of that as well. So let's start, as we often do in a scholarly process. We need to start with the purpose, which is what we're hoping many of our proposals start with as well. So the purpose of peer review. This process provides feedback that is both stringent and fair, enables an author to strengthen a work in progress, and adds value and meaning to the work that is ultimately published, helping inform the deliberations of, in this case, the ASHE Program Committee. And that comes from the AAUP Handbook Best Practices for Peer Review. I wanted to mention there is actually a deep literature base on the peer review process, and we've used that literature to inform what we're suggesting as best practices today. And I want you to just take a minute to envision with me receiving ASHE feedback. And I just envision for a second, just imagine that you had put in a proposal, you had worked a great deal of time on this proposal, and your proposal was rejected for the conference. Perhaps you were disappointed and you wondered why. You look at the ratings and you notice that across the 3 raters, there was agreement that your conceptual framing was sound. And you felt so good to be reinforced on that because you had spent a great deal of time focusing on your conceptual framework. At the same time, 2 reviewers had rated your methodology lower. You examined the comments. They helped you to understand why they rated you lower on methods, giving you specific advice about both the sampling and the analysis. And the reviewers also gave you specific advice about how to strengthen your description of the significance of the work. So in this case, although you were deeply disappointed that your proposal wasn't accepted, you felt the review was fair. And you also reconsidered how you might rework your analysis next time and might decide to resubmit your proposal to either another conference or perhaps to ASHE next year. This would be what I would describe as a strongly supportive process. And I just want you to imagine what it would feel like, even though you're disappointed, to still have a fair, detailed, and constructive process that supports you as a scholar. And this is what we're really hoping from the ASHE review process. So let's talk about some of the individual benefits of reviewing. First, reading others' proposals can help you recognize what makes a strong or weak proposal. And I know for myself, when I started to review proposals, it really helped me to formulate my own proposals going forward. I started to notice better ways to communicate my content, trying to synthesize a study that you've spent, let's say, years on into a proposal with a finite word count isn't always easy. And when you start to read through proposals, you really get a sense of what makes a great proposal. And secondly, and this is the reason that I think reviewers who've been in the field for many, many years continue to do this, reviewing gives you the opportunity to see new research in your area of interest far before it's published. So it really keeps you at the forefront and at the pulse of the field in your specific area, especially if the reviewing match has been done well. And I really encourage you to review. You'll see in your reviewer invitation email that we attached and linked to an article, Lubienski 2020, on how to review conference proposals. It's a wonderful article and really gives you a sense of that dual purpose of reviews, both to be evaluative, but also to be constructive and to give professional development. And with that, I will pass it on to Carrie Ann to discuss benefits to the field.
Good afternoon, ASHE colleagues. So let's think about the fact that each proposal that you review is on a journey, right? So in many cases, these are future journal articles. But in some cases, they might be briefs that could be used in policymaking, either to influence lobbying for more funds for higher education or state or local funds on campus. It could be to inform a program that you're arguing to create in student affairs on campus or to support a group of students, right? So each piece is on a journey. And one of the key benefits to our field, to us, is to have the great thinking, the sort of phone a friend of our colleagues to make it better, to push our thinking, to ask if we've used the most rigorous kinds of approaches and all of the theories and the past research that's been done, right? And so that's the huge benefit to the field, is that we are trying to help a piece on a journey to get even better and better and be more impactful along the way. If we go to the next slide. Now, when we don't do excellent reviews, right? When we either perhaps inadvertently did not appreciate maybe an interdisciplinary approach or a critical approach, we sort of did not appreciate the importance of looking at a particular group of students, and that comes through in a review, or when, like Corbin mentioned, there's not a match, right? And the person is left to sort of scratch their head and say, you know, wait a minute, the scores are like 1 and 2, but the comments were that this was a fantastic paper. So which one is it, right? When they're left without that critical feedback, you know, then we're letting our members down. So if we go to the next slide. And, you know, as we think about this, in particular, we realize that across many fields, there's evidence that the consequences of a lack of feedback are worse for scholars from minoritized identities, right? And if you go to the next slide, Corbin, then this research shows that not only in higher ed, of course, but across many different fields, there's a tendency for scholars from those backgrounds to receive either no feedback or this sort of scratch your head, not sure what this means feedback. And that has some pretty negative consequences. I mean, the most obvious consequence is, like everybody, it's sort of preventing somebody from a valuable resource, right? The resource that shows you before you submit to the Journal of Higher Ed or Review of Higher Ed or Research in Higher Ed, Journal of College Student Development Theory, Journal of Diversity in Higher Education, before you submit, it gives you a signpost as to what reviewers are going to say. It gives you a sense of what they'll think of this, you know, potentially the real limitations of the piece. It might even prevent you from a desk reject, right? But also, it provides a way to pull you into the community, right? And that's what we want to do, of course, with all members of the organization, but particularly newcomers to our field. We want to pull them in and say, hey, this piece fits in a community of scholarship that's been going on. Did you know that this other person does work in this area? Did you know that these are some other methods that have been used? It's like welcoming people into a room, right? And so we really want to make sure that our entire community feels welcomed into that room. If we go to the next slide. So when we look at why are we particularly paying attention to this within our own ASHE review process, we have a variety of sources of data. Overall, people are very satisfied with our review process, but there have been some places where we could up our game and improve, right? And so, for example, we get conference evaluation data every year. We also had a strategic planning process as an organization and a conference planning group that looked at data over multiple years, like the last 5 years of people's satisfaction with the peer review process and the conference overall. And also our staff who are James and Jason, who are very into this data, and past program chairs will write reports on what worked, what could be improved. And from all of that, we saw several things. One was some proposals were unfortunately getting one line of feedback and it was cryptic or no feedback at all. There was a structural issue we've tried to remedy where people were getting too many proposals to review. There was also, in some cases, a mismatch where there wasn't a reviewer, perhaps, who had the same methodological background or expertise associated with a proposal, which can make the feedback not as great as it could be in that area. And so we've done some structural things. We, of course, tried to welcome more people into the review process by requiring folks to submit a paper and have earned a degree, a doctorate to engage as a reviewer. We've reduced the number of proposals folks submit. But if we go to the next slide, we also wanted to just provide reviewers with some resources right before you review. We wanted you to dwell a little bit on what's a good review in this webinar for an hour. I want to thank Corbin Campbell and Julie Park for helping to put together a brief that synthesizes the research that's been done on sort of the like top 10 hits, you might want to say, of things to think about when you're reviewing. You're about to see some very concrete examples of helpful and unhelpful reviews, and of course there's going to be a panel talking about that. We have as a resource you looking exactly at the template that you're supposed to use to evaluate the reviews, which is another thing that the research says is cue people's attention to very specific criteria right before they judge something. And of course the article that Corbin mentioned. So with that, I will hand it back over to Corbin.
Great, thank you so much, Carrie-Ann. This is so now we get to talk about some really concrete, I'm going to say nuts and bolts parts of best practices in ASHE peer review, meaning now that you're a reviewer, what should you be doing to ensure that we have a really quality, reliable, fair process? Because we know that this has real implications for scholarly careers. We know that it has real implications for the efficacy that new scholars feel. And we also know that it has real implications for the knowledge that's produced in our field, so the quality of the work that's coming down the line. So we're going to go through some concrete suggestions, and the way we've structured this webinar is, you'll hear this is pretty nuts and bolts. And then at the end, we have a wonderful panel that's going to bring that to life in terms of how they've experienced the review process. So the first practice is we do need to ensure that you have the right expertise and also no conflicts to review each proposal. And so we're asking that right now, you now have the ability to access your proposals that you're going to be reviewing. Please make sure and skim all of these proposals right now in the next few days. Just skim them. You don't need to do the reviews right away. Of course, feel free, but definitely skim them first, just to ensure that you have either the topical or the methodological expertise that you need to review this proposal. And so one of the promises that we've made to authors this year in particular is that all proposals will have all of their reviewers have expertise in the topic and or the method. So if you're an expert either in the topic or the method, you are an appropriate reviewer. If you read the proposal and think, oh wow, I'm not exactly sure why this was sent to me, I really don't have expertise in the topic, I really don't know this method, please do reach out to the section chair for that particular review so that they can reassign you. We want to make sure that that match is well done. And I want to give a real shout out to the 2020 program committee who worked. I can't even tell you how hard they've worked over the past couple of weeks to make sure that that match exists. But we also know that things can fall through the cracks, even with the best of intentions and the hardest work. And so if you feel like it's not the quite right proposal for you to review, please let us know. We want somebody who can provide that kind of quality feedback. And of course, conflicts are also something we need to avoid. So if somebody's in your institution or you know them, they're a close colleague, you recognize their work, this is supposed to be a masked process. And so it's really important that that person is not identified to you in any kind of way. So the second thing is we do want to suggest that you read the evaluation criteria for each proposal prior to reading and reviewing the proposal. Now, one of the things that you'll know is that ASHE has lots of different categories of proposals, right? So it could be a research paper proposal, it could be an interactive symposia proposal, it could be a roundtable proposal, and each one of those has different criteria that you'll be reviewing on. So make sure that every time you go to review a paper, you go back and review those criteria before you review. And the reasons to do this are that we all have pet topics, for example, and if we're not focusing specifically on the evaluation criteria, we might just get excited about a proposal because it's in our area, right? But if we really focus on exactly what we're supposed to be judging, that will help us to make sure that we're more focused on the author's intentions. We also want to make sure that we're not giving ratings based on a general feeling of the proposal. Like one example might be, maybe there's a conceptual framework that you feel deeply invested in, and so you get so excited about the proposal that you're tempted to rate very highly across all the criterion. But if you focus on each one of the criterion, so focus on the method, focus on the conceptual framework, focus on the significance, each individually, that will really help you to make sure that you have a fair review and a reliable review. The third thing is that there's 3 different forms of ratings that you are going to be doing as a reviewer for ASHE. The first is that you will be giving numerical ratings based on the criterion that I just described. The second is that you'll have an opportunity to give comments where you can qualitatively describe your impressions of the proposal. And then third, you're going to select whether you think the program committee should accept or reject the rating. And we would love for you to first fill out the numerical ratings in the comments before you fill out the accept reject categorical rating. And this will allow your final decision about the proposal to build off of the evaluation criteria and your comments. And then this number 4, I actually think may be the most important one of all, because this is the piece, the quality comments is the piece where we're going to make this a developmental process. Regardless of whether the proposal is accepted or rejected, we need to help develop the scholarship of our field and also the scholars in it. And so we know that for some, this may be their very first interaction with the ASHE process. And for others, it may be a process where they're starting to build their scholarly sense of identity. And what we write in the comments can either build up a scholar in a constructive way that allows them to continue to improve and change the scholarship that they're producing for our field. It could also, unfortunately, be destructive. And we're going to show some examples of that as well. So in order to provide some quality comments, some things to do are to highlight both positive aspects and also areas of improvement for all proposals. So even if it's a proposal that you think is wouldn't make the cut and it is a it might be a rejected proposal, we want to see both positive things that the scholar can build off of and feel good about, as well as some things for them to improve upon. And I know Carrie Ann likes to talk about the sandwich approach. I like that as well. So if there's something up front that you can call out that you really think is positive, then describe constructively areas that you think that they could improve, and make sure and have a constructive and helpful tone when you talk about those areas for improvement. And then I do like to bring it back around with sort of a general feeling of what's really positive about the proposal. And so this is another thing that's new for this year. just to make sure that all authors are receiving receiving comments on each proposal, we have created a 50-word minimum, but we hope that you would create about 2 paragraphs of comments, constructive and quality comments for the authors. And then finally, we'll ask for you to review for consistency across the 3 forms of evaluation criteria. So remember how I mentioned you'll have numerical ratings, you'll be able to comment on the proposal, and then ultimately you will select accept or reject. And so we want to make sure that if you accept a proposal, it has high numerical ratings and the comments reflect those positive aspects. We also want to make sure that if it's a reject proposal, that it has lower numerical ratings on average, and the comments help to the author to understand why it is that you rated the lower ratings in those areas. I'm also trying to give some we're also trying to give some guidance this year, because some people generally will just rate proposals lower, right? So for some people, perhaps without any guidance, a 3 on average would be a good proposal, while others, you know, only all 5s would be a good proposal, because all of that might be relative and internal to any reviewer. So this year, we're trying to create some consistency to allow the program committee to have some guidance. And so if you believe a proposal is worthy of accept, please ensure your numerical ratings rate an average of 4 or above. Now, I want to mention that this is not going to be a simple cutoff. So we're not going to simply accept every proposal that has more than 4 and simply reject every proposal that has less than 4. But by giving this guidance, that will help us when we're looking across reviewers to know that we're all using the same frame of reference. And so section by section, there might be slight differences based on the number of proposals and the number of slots, etc. But we do want to give that guidance so we have the same frame of reference. An average of 4 or more is what raters should be gauging would be an accept proposal. And then finally, I did want to mention there's another box, comments to the association, and this is great for 3 reasons. There are going to be a bunch of proposals that you feel are on the margin. You feel like there's a lot of really good things about them. Perhaps in your numerical ratings, they came in just under a 4, or maybe just over a 4, but there's some nagging pieces of it that you described in your comments. This would be a great place to be able to describe your feelings about any proposals that you think are on the margin. You can also describe here if you think a proposal should be considered for an alternative format. So for example, if it's a research paper proposal and you feel like it's a little bit underdeveloped and could use some discussion across a close group of colleagues, that might be a great time to recommend a roundtable. And also, this is not often the case in our association, but unfortunately it does happen that you may notice an ethical question or a question of plagiarism, and the comments to the association would be a great place to note that. And those comments only need to be a sentence or 2. So now we're going to go through some examples. We have a couple of really positive review examples, constructive and reliable. And then we have some reviews that we would want revised. And so these are all fictitious reviews. None of these are real. We created these for the purpose of this webinar. But let's take a look. So we're going to take a look at the criterion ratings. What you'll see here is that there's a lot of variation across this criterion ratings. And this is from the research paper criterion. You'll see some are rated more highly and some are rated lower. And then one of the things I noticed right away is that there's a lot of comments. So this person clearly took a great deal of time thinking through and being detailed about their response to this paper. You don't always need to write 4 paragraphs, but so you'll see some examples of shorter ones as well. But here we'll take a look. We say this proposal is well written. You can see we've got a nice beginning to the sandwich, a positive comment here. We see a couple of concerns that they're describing very specifically. They're describing some concerns with the literature review, the conceptual model. And what I like to see here in this reliable example is that when we look at the criterion ratings, you'll see 2s listed for literature review and 2 listed for conceptual framework. So we've got some good reliability across what they're saying in the comments and the way they rate it in the criterion. And then we see another section here at the very end that talks about what they appreciate most about the proposal. In this case, it's a very comprehensive data set, a multi-institutional data set. And you'll see in the criterion ratings that data sources is rated 5. So we have really nice reliability there across those two different forms of rating. Well, comments isn't really a form of rating, but it's a way that we can understand the thinking of the reviewer. And so here we have a decision of reject. Now this one you could see might have been slightly on the margin, but as you can see, if you averaged across the criterion ratings, it would be below 4. And we see enough substantive advice for the author that they could build off of this going forward. Let's look at another constructive and reliable example. Here, this is for an interactive symposium, so you'll see different criteria. This is why it's so important to read that criteria before you go in and do your ratings. And you'll see here across the board, pretty high ratings. So we're going to expect to see some very positive comments. And you'll see overall, this proposal is well conceived and give some specific examples of how it's positive. And then also what I like about this, this particular review is that they're very positive across the board, but they also still provide some developmental advice here to these authors. The 4 experts on this proposal all bring unique perspective to the issue, but I do wonder how presenter 4 would bring their study of students' perspective on governance to bear on the faculty discussion. So here they could really build off of that. And you'll see that that's a slight difference. You know, most of the others are 5s. That area is 4 on the criterion ratings. And here it is, accept. That's what we would expect. For the unconstructive let's look at some unconstructive examples. So here, let's take a look at the criterion ratings. You'll see some variation across 3s and 1s, but pretty low ratings here. And here's the comments. This is one of the worst proposals I've read methodologically. You can't make causal inferences from these data. Perhaps review your notes from your early methods classes. The decision is reject. Now, why is this a poor example? One of the things you'll see is that it's fairly reliable. We've got low average ratings. We've got a decision of reject, and we have negative comments. So this review, as you could probably tell as I read it, is condescending. So that's a big problem. And unfortunately, that's sort of the brand of unconstructive comments that sometimes we see in ASHE is this sort of condescending tone, or you might consider it sort of like incivil. We don't want to see incivility in the comments in ASHE. And the other piece is that the comments here are really not specific enough to make any improvements, right? So we don't have any sandwich approach. There's got to be something in this proposal that the reviewer appreciated. That should be highlighted. And the other thing is that if there is an issue with the methodology, we need to be more specific to help that author to improve. Let's look at another unconstructive example. So here we have criterion ratings, and this is a different brand of unconstructive. So here we have 2s across the entire criterion ratings. And here are the comments. I want to thank the author for their proposal. That sounds good, a nice start to the sandwich. However, this proposal leaves a lot to be desired theoretically, methodologically, and it is underdeveloped. And a decision of reject. So again, we have, it's pretty reliable across the 3 ways that we are making decisions in this review, but the comments are too broad to be helpful. Also, there's no variation at all in the criterion ratings, which makes me believe that they might have made a general judgment about this proposal rather than rating specifically with the criteria. And as we know, that lends more to bias in the review process. So we want to go back to those criterion. Now that we've looked at a couple unconstructive but reliable reviews, let's look at a couple unreliable examples. So here we see the criterion ratings across the board are, and all of these are research paper criterions, have the research paper criteria. You'll see 4s and 5s. So if we took an average, it would be above 4. We would imagine that they would be tuning their ratings in that way towards accept. So the comments, I deeply appreciate the topic, and the quotes really highlight the lived experiences of the phenomenon. And you'll see here that these are mostly positive comments, and then we have reject. So really hard for the person to understand when they get this review, why this person might have rejected this proposal when in fact they had really strong ratings and they had positive comments. Here's another brand of unreliable. So here we have, here we have some variation across the criterion ratings and a little on the lower end, right? So if we took an average, it would have been somewhere in the 3s. Actually, I think exactly 3. So so that tells us that that if we're tuning again, this probably wouldn't be an accept. And yet, we also have some interesting reliability issues here because we have, I appreciate the newly developed conceptual framework, and yet when we end the review of the literature, but here we have 2s and 3s on the literature and conceptual framework criterion ratings. So this reviewer needs to tune what they think is a good rating up to 4. And then I think this is our final example here. Yeah, this is our final example. So this is an example that is both unconstructive and also unreliable. So here we have criterion ratings where you see there's a mix of 3s and 5s, but a little more 3s than 5s. So again, this is a sort of on the margins rating, but maybe slightly lower than the accept threshold. And here we have comments. I like this proposal because the topic is so important to the higher education landscape. Learning outcomes assessment is too often left off the agenda. And although this study doesn't have a strong data set and the framework is missing foundational work of Ewell and others, this would make a strong contribution because the topic is so significant. Now, we have this, obviously some of the comments and the examples we're putting out there are purposefully a little extreme, right? But we have this brand of unconstructive review quite a bit. So first of all, we think that this reviewer might have had a pet topic here, right? And we all do get excited about the topics that we research on our own, and we'd love to see more of those topics included in ASHE. It's just a natural part of having scholarly passion, which has been written about well in the higher education literature base by Newman and others. So we know that we have this passion about our topic, but we haven't done a good job of really basing our decision of accept on what we're seeing in the criterion ratings. And so the criterion ratings are not necessarily reflecting the decision that we think should really should happen here. So those are some examples that give you a few of the brands of constructive and destructive, reliable and unreliable reviews to just get you warmed up with some of the ways to tune your mindset as you come in to do a review so that it's supportive and developmental for the authors. And with that, I will pass it off to Carrie Ann to discuss more about the mindset around peer review.
Okay, coming up is our awesome panel. So I just want to give you a few more examples from reviews I've received or seen along the way. So, unhelpful would be that we're really not listening to the piece. And so we focus on such a minor detail that the person's story is not getting to us. So for example, I'm not paying attention to the overall content, but on page 3, I see an APA citation that, is the thing that kills the proposal for somebody. Or I'm not convinced, I like this other topic. I'm not convinced your topic is important, and just talking about that other topic that you think is more important. Or saying overall the writing is poor without giving any examples of how it could be improved. Or saying something like, I think somebody did this before and this isn't very novel. Or I'm not really sure if, this is unique enough. Those are not helpful. Some more specific examples are, if you were to say, this study uses really strong composite variables of the constructs it's trying to assess, right? That's a strength of the piece. The study has a unique and comprehensive database that I have not seen before when studying this topic. I liked the way the author used vignettes to explain a theory in practice. Or the implications of this study are really clear and really important for admissions officers and how they think about equity. Those are, that's constructive, right? And then in areas of improvement, other examples would be, there's a really important background context that this case study is not considering, such as the landscape of a Catholic liberal arts college. That is a big part of the case. It's not there, it should be described. Or the implications of the findings could be clear, the so what effect. So who will find this information important and why, if you could clarify that. Or saying there are some important methods details that are left out that I know reviewers will want to know, so such as the number of specific interviews, how participants were selected, how the data was analyzed, or something to the effect of consider adding a visual that maps out the how and why of your findings for readers. So we want to try to listen to the piece for what it is and think about its next steps. And in that way, we're trying to see, okay, down the road, reviewers for this journal or this next step might really see this limitation. Could the person address it between now and when they put the paper in? And also, do they realize they've got this unique thing about their paper that they could highlight as one of its benefits? And now I'm going to turn it back to Corbin to introduce our panel.
Wonderful. Thanks, Carrie-Ann. So now I have the distinct pleasure of getting to introduce our wonderful panel who I've had the pleasure and privilege of getting to work with over the past year or so as we've been thinking about this ASHE 2020 conference, because all three of these panelists are on the ASHE 2020 program committee and have been really helping us to make sure that we have great reviewers for the ASHE conference proposals. So all of you on this webinar are a product of both your volunteering and also these wonderful program committee section chairs helping to assign you. But the other piece of why we're having them on this panel is that each one of them has been identified as having really exemplary reviews in the past. And they also, I will say, just as we were talking about this webinar, they have such a wonderful way of describing the experience of being a reviewer. For all of you in the audience, I imagine you've either received a review or given a review. And maybe when you received a review, it really gave you, hopefully for the positive experiences, it gave you a sense of efficacy, a sense of agency for your career. On the other side, there may be times that you've received really negative reviews, and those reviews can be truly destructive, both in mindset and also in actually what plays out on a CV. These reviewers and program chairs that we've asked to be on this panel have been so thoughtful about faculty career journeys as well as knowledge production and how the review process can support that in wholehearted ways. So on this panel, we have Dr. Frederick No, from an assistant professor from the University of Nevada, Dr. Wilson McKellow, assistant professor at UNCW, and Dr. Rosie Perez, assistant professor from Iowa State University. And I'm so pleased to welcome you all. I want to make sure that you are great. I can see you now, so that's great to see. And for the audience, this would be a great time to switch from active speaker view to the view where you can see them all, so that we can really get a nice view of this wonderful panel as they respond to us. And so just to start out, the first question that I'll ask is, we've talked about a lot of different suggestions in this webinar, but a lot of it has been from, as I mentioned before, sort of a nuts and bolts perspective. And I'm wondering, with your own experiences as reviewers, which one of these suggestions and best practices do you feel resonate most with you about an important review process? And can you describe that a little bit? And we'll go in the order of alphabetically last name. So we'll start with Frederick.
Thank you. I definitely resonate with the point about constructive criticism and how important that is for the review process. I was actually on the program committee for ARA Division J for 2 years, and this is my first year in the ASHE committee. And, you know, I don't know everything about higher education. And so Ben Selznick and I, who are the co-chairs for the outcomes, student outcomes section, we have tried to assign reviewers that have some expertise with these proposals that we may not be so familiar with. And so from my perspective, it's like, oftentimes it's the one chance that someone who has sent in a proposal the one chance they'll get to get some external feedback from someone who has some content or methodological expertise in an area that they're interested in. So we're really hoping that as reviewers, you do provide something constructive that can help move their proposal forward from someone who knows the field a little bit better. And when I think about like the process, I think one thing that really helps proposals improve is understanding the contribution that is being made. And this has been shared a little bit, but I think the way I think about it is also like, how can you help the author clarify the contribution of like their question? Like, is it a really new and intriguing question that they're asking, or are they expanding the literature in some way? Another type of contribution is like a data or methods contribution. So like, is it this really interesting and new context that's being explored, or some methodological innovation? And lastly, there's also the contributions that are more about the findings and implications and significance of the study. Like, are the findings challenging the existing literature? Are they really, or are they confirming something in existing literature that really needs to be confirmed? So I think, as you go about the reviews, I like to think of how can I help the author clarify what the contribution of the study is, because that's usually what makes proposals really pop.
You may be on mute, but that's okay.
Apologies. Okay, great. So we have Wilson next.
Okay. Well, thank you all for having me. I really appreciate Frederick's offering as he thinks about this notion of the contribution. For me, I also try to think about the principal idea that's being advanced, right? And so in order to help do that, the conversation around expertise, right, particularly around sort of topical and methodological expertise was really resonating with me. But I also think this could be a double-edged sword as well, right? And so thinking about, for me, how are we mindful as reviewers, or personally as a reviewer, how am I mindful of my positionality, and particularly how my philosophical underpinnings, my values, my beliefs, my ideas about what good research is, how is that informing my read of the proposals, right? And I guess in addition to that, am I imposing my beliefs on a particular proposal such that I'm not able to see the possibilities, right, within it? And so, I think it's important, again, to Frederick's point, thinking about how ideas or works in progress. I try to be mindful about how my allegiance to a particular way of knowing, for example, can hinder possibilities, right? I think, Corbin, you talked about this notion of our pet projects, right? And I think expertise in some ways can become a very territorial, right? Whereas I'm actively thinking about how do I not sort of expand it, but how do I keep sort of me and this sort of cadre of others who I know do this work? How do I sort of protect our stay in this, as the experts in this particular way, right? And so trying to think about, how can we both bring our expertise, but also allow for expansiveness as we think about the review process.
Thanks, Wilson. And Rosie?
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for having me on the panel today. One of the things, suggestions that really resonated with me was the idea of alignment. And I think we're often quick to want to judge other people's work, but without giving as much thought to how honest are we in our review, and how do we hold ourselves to a particular standards that before I click submit, I always kind of gauge how honest am I? Is my review aligned with what I really think about this? And so I really like the idea of, I do a thorough read kind of from the nuts and bolts perspective. I saw some questions for folks who said, I haven't done this before. When I read, I take notes in another space, right? Sometimes folks will try to write their comments into the all academic portal as they're reading. It can get really hard to synthesize when you're toggling between screens. I don't have that capacity. So I find that I need to take notes and synthesize those thoughts. And so I'll do the numeric ratings, I'll write my comments, and then I really will, kind of as Corbin suggested, look back. Like if I had a lot of thoughts around there was some missing literature or some really big gaps in the methodology, does the numeric rating match what I wrote summatively? You know, does that match? And sometimes it does. And if it doesn't, I really have to rethink, well, what is more reflective of my actual thought about this proposal? Sometimes I'll even go back and read it again to say, what do I really think about this? Maybe my first instinct wasn't right when I read it. And then I'll offer that accept or reject, really making sure that there's some clear alignment. I think there are times where you're thinking, this has a lot of potential, I'm not sure. And that suggestion, I use that box to the program committee quite a bit. This one has a lot of strengths. There are some areas where I think, you know, if there's space or if you're not sure, this one would be like really well suited to a roundtable. So I think it's okay as a reviewer, in keeping yourself honest, which I think is what we owe our colleagues, to also offer that if you're uncertain, to folks who will look across raters. So I do think that also helps a program committee kind of calibrate. Is if everyone's uncertain, what does that mean, right? That can help a program committee make some good decisions. So those are some things that really resonated with me about the process.
Thank you all so much. It's so wonderful for me to hear how you've really resonated in your own experiences with these different pieces. And one of the things that's just occurring to me just as I hear you all is this is such a deeply thoughtful and substantive process, right? This is something, it takes time. It takes time to do a real quality review. This is one of the reasons that we decided to reduce the number of proposals that that across the board, the average ASHE reviewer was getting. I know, actually, it's been funny. There's been on social media some conversation about the Quince Club, the folks who had gotten 15 reviews typically. The reason that I bring that up is that we assigned a max of 12 to all reviewers this year. And the reason for that is that I'm not saying that you couldn't do 15 or couldn't do 20 well, but I just know the burden of time. I mean, it simply takes an incredible amount of time to do the thoughtful work that you all just described. I was thinking about how reflective you just described that process to be, and how it's both an introspective process and also a process of really reflecting deeply about what the intentions of that author is, right? And being able to try and really think through that piece as well as what is the intentions of this author and how can I support that? And I really appreciated that. So this next question for the three of you is about specifically how you go about doing a constructive and reliable, quality and equity-oriented review process. So this is the how. Rosie, one thing you mentioned is you take notes on the side, but for our new reviewers and our reviewers that are just refreshing and wanting to know what's the universe of possibilities of how to review, how can I do it in a new and different way? Tell us a little bit about like how do you do your review? What's your strategy? If you can talk about your experience of reviewing, that would be great. And let's start. We'll start with we'll go Wilson, Rosie, and then Frederick this time. Okay.
I appreciate those thoughts. And one thing you said I think is really interesting and true. I think ASHE, at least in our process, this year's process, is really thinking about how to be thoughtful, to be introspective, to be mindful of who our colleagues are. But I would venture to say, right, and we know this to be true, that the academy is not that, right? The academy is still steeped in whiteness. The academy is still steeped in rationality and objectivity. The academy seeks to depersonalize this process in a way that moves individuals away from sort of the lifeblood of the proposal and sees a text, and that's it, right? I'm evaluating a text sort of as objectively as possible. And so if we're going to sort of move forward, I think we'll ultimately need to move and sort of reinvent our processes, right? But that's I think a larger conversation. For me, it's seeing this work and seeing every proposal as personal, right? As embodied work. Folks are literally bringing their spirits, their souls to these processes. And so how can I not only layer expertise and rigor, but how can I infuse grace in those proposals as well? And so it's thinking about, regardless of how frustrated I might be about a particular issue. So for example, we know that folks are misusing CRT. We know that folks are misusing intersectionality, Black feminisms, all these sorts of frameworks. And right, our expertise, our rigor does not need to be devoid of grace, right? Because there was a moment where we didn't have it all figured out as well. And so, so for me, it's thinking about how I can extend grace, and in extending grace, perhaps it's how can I, if there's there's particular sources or that I can offer to strengthen a proposal, or a suggestion about how this analysis could be reworked, right? But offering those comments within the proposal so that the reviewer, or I'm sorry, the authors get a sense for what my thinking is. Even if they don't agree with it, they can at least sort of track how I'm thinking about the proposal, or how I'm attempting to read it. And so, so I'm thinking about expertise, I'm thinking about grace, and I'm thinking about how we can extend resources for them and extend potential pathways for them.
Thank you so much, Wilson. I was really appreciating your description of how we're taking baby steps to improve processes, right? And even when the broader system has needs for improvement. So, thank you for bringing that, bringing that to light. And so much of what you're describing is true, right? Like you can describe trying to get somebody to bring forth an author in a way that would be unconstructive, right? Like, this paper fails to think about this person's work. Or like you're saying, it could be with grace, right? Like it could be describing, have you considered the work of this person that might inform your conceptual framework in a way that could support your, thorough perspectives on CRT, right? So I mean, so much of what you're describing, that grace, there's so much of the how of great reviews that's so important. So thank you for that. And Rosie.
So my comments really build nicely with Wilson's. In order to extend grace and when I think about reviewing with the spirit of generosity as a colleague, to me that requires monitoring my own energy level. So I really, if I have 10 proposals to review, I am not going to do 10 in one day or 10 in one sitting. Some people can. I know that my attention span, how thorough and attentive I can be in that read, and then sometimes how generous if I'm tired, towards the end won't be there, right? So if we have 2 weeks, I really do kind of block out times, like I can do at max like 3 here, 3 there, because then each proposal gets my full time and attention. I can write that thorough and constructive, read for the author. I know if I'm having a bad day and I had blocked out that time, I also don't block the time right at the very end, because I know if I'm not in a good headspace or just had a bad day, am I as likely to be as generous and thoughtful with my feedback? And the answer is sometimes no. And I think over the years, I've kind of learned that about myself to kind of gauge, like, this is probably, I'm not bringing good energy today, and I don't want to give that to somebody whose work doesn't deserve like that. Because if I had a bad day, what I'm writing might not be a full reflection of my thoughts of the potential of the scholarship. So again, I think it comes back to me really thinking about how do I be honest with myself so that I can be the best colleague I can in the review process.
Thanks so much, Rosie. I had never really thought about the importance of like monitoring one's energy in that space. That's really wonderful. And Frederick?
Yeah, thanks to Wilson and Rosie for talking about like the bias and positionality in the review process. One form of bias in particular that came to mind when first thought about this question was our bias towards like beautiful writing. I think we can often get seduced by beautiful writing, and it makes a paper or proposal seem more high quality just because of the way it's written. And writing is important and clear communication is important. But sometimes beautiful writing is like just a cover for more like basic ideas, right? And I'm totally guilty of this. Right before the webinar started, I'm totally writing a paper that's a pretty straightforward, descriptive analysis of something, but I think it's beautiful writing, and hopefully that's going to get it through, right? But I think that, the writing issue and like quote good or quality writing, it's an equity issue, right? Because some people and scholars have had access to spaces and contexts and systems of support that help them to cultivate what is quote good writing skills. And I think for individuals who haven't had that, it can systematically disadvantage them in these types of processes where you're kind of adjudicating based on writing quality sometimes. And so I think, harking back to my first point, like I try to remember, like, is there this contribution? What is the author trying to say? Is this an interesting study? And like those kinds of questions are weigh just as heavily, if not more, than is this well written?
Thank you so much to all three of you. I feel like one of the things that I've gotten from this panel is not only your individual approaches that make the reviews that you do so substantive, but I'm also mindful of the power that reviewers have, and that that power really requires us to be ever so thoughtful about what goes into this. And so thank you for that deep reminder. I hope we all hold that as we go forward as reviewers in this process. And so now, in the last couple minutes of our webinar, I will turn it over to Carrie Ann, who will sum it up for us. But you'll have to give me a moment as I try and screen share here. There's two things that I need to do to make this work. So hold on one second here.
No problem. I can actually start talking while you do, Corbin. So I want to thank the panelists as well. And I just want to say, as Rosie was mentioning being tired, I was thinking of the work on social biases and judges, and how if they, look at two cases, one before lunch and one after, when they're hungry and tired, that there's a harsher penalty to the one right before lunch than the one after. So, these kinds of, if we're tired, kinds of biases are real, and they're in so many different kinds of areas. And I also really appreciated Frederick's, comment to not be seduced by awesome writing. It's a very easy thing to happen. And I want to also go back to, I love the phrase extending grace that Wilson used. That's just such a beautiful way of thinking about this. And it also reminds me of Chris Wren, shout out to Chris Wren's presidential speech about generous thinking. And that's really what we want to do. We want to be involved in generous thinking. So in summary, here's just a few things to summarize. The first thing is, before you submit, as I think Rosie was saying before, look at the feedback you've provided and say to yourself, number one, is it consistent across? But number two, is the person walking away with something valuable? Did we give the gift we wanted to give, which was that they got a sense from us of what was special about this piece, or could be, as well as what could be improved, so that you're giving somebody the gift that they can take and improve the piece afterwards. And really just think about this as an investment in each other. It's one of the most important things that we do as ASHE colleagues and within our field, to help people bring their piece the next step on that journey. So in closing, I want to thank our ASHE staff. I want to thank Jason, our executive director, and James, our conference coordinator, for helping to plan this. A big shout out to Corbin and Julie, our 2020 program co-chairs, for all the work that they did, and to Rosie, Frederick, and Wilson for their very humanistic approach and for making it real for us. Remember that there are these resources that are on the ASHE website that you can go to as you're doing your review process that we've created for you. And thank you so much for investing in each other through this review process. And I think we're done. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jason and James, as well. Thank you, everybody.